So a couple of weeks ago, I was chasing YouTube rabbits. Do y'all know what that is? That's where you start out watching a 3-minute video on how to cook the perfect steak, and 2 hours later you look up and you're watching Russian dashcam crash videos, and you're like, how did I get here, and where did the time go? And in the process of watching that, I ran across a comedian who was telling a story about finding a wallet in a cab. And rather than give it to the cab driver, he thought, look, I'm going to take the wallet. He had this fantasy that he was going to find a wallet one day, and it was going to turn out to be from a famous person, and he'd get to hang out with a famous person, whatever. He said, so I took the wallet. I went to my hotel room. He was in Washington, D.C., doing a comedy show. He said, I went to my hotel room. I opened the wallet up, and it had a grocery card, $2, and a junior college ID card with a photo. And that was it. Nothing that would allow me to really, check on this guy. Now, this was pre-internet. This was social media. This is like probably 2000. There's no Facebook. Now he's just like, oh, look, Scott Hill. Oh, there's 5,000 Scotts, but, I'm connected to this one. We can do that now. If you didn't know, now you can look up all your friends. All right, and all your not friends. And so, anyway, he called the grocery store. That got him nowhere. He called the junior college, and he said, I spent, no kidding, he said, I got so obsessed with finding this kid and giving him his $2 and his junior college ID back that he said, I spent 2 days on the phone going to different departments in this junior college just to try to get information to get this kid his wallet back. And finally, I got a phone number for him. I called the phone number. This guy answers the phone, and he goes, Like, well, that's weird. So I said, hello, and he goes, And he's like, I don't really know what's going on here. So he said, sir, I found a wallet. And it's Justin, I don't remember the kid's last name, and he said, oh, that's my son. And he said, it's probably his. He said, did it have any money in it? He said, I bet it didn't, because my son's a loser. And the guy's like, what? How did this conversation go this direction this fast? He's like, he's never going to amount to anything. I'm not surprised he lost it. I would just throw it away and not even worry about it. And the comedian's like, no, sir, I can't do that. He said, I'd really like to, get this wallet back. Your son, the guy says, you know what, I'll tell him you called, and he hangs up. He said, but he hung up, but he never got my information. He said, so I thought, well, it's a lost cause. He said, but I threw that wallet in a side pocket of my suitcase and left it there. 1 year later, he's back in Washington, D.C. to do another comedy show. After the show, he goes to a restaurant in Washington, D.C. A waiter comes up to his table and says, good evening, welcome to whatever restaurant. Would you like to hear tonight's specials? And he said, I looked up and I went, Justin? And Justin goes, yeah, have we met? He said, I have your wallet. I'm the guy that has your wallet. And Justin said, oh yeah, I remember my dad telling you about that. Would you like to hear the specials? And the comedian's like, boy, he's like, no, you don't understand. I have your wallet. And apparently Justin didn't care. It didn't really click. And the guy's like, in my mind, I'm thinking of all of the things that had to align for this moment to happen. And all this kid wants to know is, do I want to hear tonight's specials? So I said, Justin, do you not want your wallet back? He said, well, yes, I'll take it back. And he said, do you have it on you? He's like, no, I don't have it on me, but I do have it in my hotel room. So Justin goes to the hotel room that night, knocks on the door. The guy opens the door and says, look, I have your wallet. Justin takes the wallet and says, thanks, and turns around and walks away. And the comedian he's like, I cannot fathom the attitude of this kid to not be able to grasp the moment of the miraculous moment of everything that had to take place for there to be no contact. And in a city like Washington, D.C., I sit at your table in your restaurant and you're my waiter, He said, so I shut the door and I'm fuming. I'm like, and I opened the door and I just yelled down the hall, Justin, your dad was right. Close the door. I'm telling that story for a reason. When I started studying this passage a couple of weeks ago, almost every commentary I looked at made an effort to point out that God is not mentioned in chapter 37 of Genesis. And they're right. That's a fact. There's no mention of God in this chapter, and the exclusion's not an accident. But don't assume everything in the Scripture is there for a purpose, or what's left out is left out for a purpose. Now, don't start preaching on the what's left out. That'll get you in trouble. But the commentators encourage readers to take the exclusion as instead of focusing on a direct reference to God, focus on the doctrine in the story, which is the doctrine of man and evil and those things. And they're not wrong. That's the doctrine of man's in here. There's some clear teachings about the doctrine of evil in this text. But I know the end of the story. And I had gone that route. And I had developed one of the most depressing sermons on the doctrine of man you've ever heard in your entire life. And then Friday afternoon, I'm struggling with a handful of verses in this text, trying to answer the question, why is verse 15, 16, and 17 in Genesis? Who is this man, this rando man that finds Joseph? And we're going to get there. Y'all don't worry. You don't have to flip there right now. You're like, what's he talking about? We're going to get there. And so I wrote a different sermon. If this were a fairy tale, I would end this sermon talking about the moral of the dangers of envy. And there's some stuff to learn about envy in here, but this is not a fairy tale. This is a historic narrative of the life of Joseph and how God worked providentially in this family and with these people to ultimately bring salvation to the known world at the time. And we see through this story contrasting themes of obedience and disobedience, and we see the insight and just how wicked the heart of man can be. And if we look at the passage in a certain way, the only thing we'll see is evil, 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 and then at the end, grief. But as I studied the passage, it caused me to consider some things in a different light and a different question. God's not mentioned in this passage, so where is he? This is the question. In the midst of all this evil, where is God? So let's read together, starting in verse 12. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. And he said to him, here I am. So he said to him, go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields. And the man asked him, what are you seeking? I'm seeking my brothers, he said. Tell me, please, where are they, pasturing the flock? And the man said, they have gone away, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan, and they saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. And they said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Come, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. When Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of the hands, saying, let us not take his life. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood, throw him in the pit here in the wilderness, do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. They sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming to Gilead, and with the camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh, and on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew to Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. And when Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where shall I go?" Then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not." And he identified it and said, "It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him to Egypt, in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. I want us to see God in this passage. See, in this passage, there just happened to be a man, and he just happened to know where the brothers were. When we get to this point in the story, a small amount of time has passed between Joseph's announcement of the dream that he will be Lord of these brothers, but not enough time has passed where it's still not a pretty touchy subject. The brothers are traveled about 50 miles from Hebron with their flocks. They apparently were they were probably in the land that Jacob had actually purchased in Shechem years earlier. However, it's this issue of Joseph, and the favoritism is still fresh on their minds. So Jacob sends Joseph to check on his brothers. Now we know this is a common occurrence. Early in the chapter, last week, if you remember, Joseph gave a report to Jacob on the brothers, and it was not a good report. And that's kind of one of the catalysts that started this whole issue between Joseph and the brothers. We know it didn't go well for Joseph. This bad report is on top of the coat and the symbolism of the coat, if you remember that from last week. And I'm not sure why Jacob thought it was a good idea to send Joseph to these brothers, but he did. I assume, probably never in his wildest dreams, did he think the brothers would actually do harm to Joseph. But these brothers hated Joseph. If you remember, they couldn't even bring themselves to say a kind word to him. That's how much they hate him. The tension's real. Joseph knows it's a problem. And we don't know if he felt like he was in any danger, but he definitely knew going to these brothers was going to be conflict. But no matter what the reason, no matter what the circumstance, the interesting thing here in this text is that Joseph obeyed. It never crossed his mind to question the father's instructions. The statement here in verse 13, "Here I am," is the statement of obedience. It's a very pointed statement of obedience. I am here to serve. So when Jacob calls Joseph and says, "I need you to go do this," Joseph says, "Just tell me what I need to do." It's reminiscent of what Brent read this morning in Isaiah 6, when in the vision of holiness of God, God says, "Who will go to Israel and call them to repentance?" And Isaiah says, "Here am I, send me." Joseph was obedient. It did not matter that his brothers hated him. Joseph was obedient. His attitude here was, "I'm here to serve the Father." So Joseph travels to Shechem, about 50 miles away. When he gets there, his brothers have left. And they've gone to Dothan. We don't know why they went to Dothan. They just happened to go where one of the great routes for the slave trade between Asia and Egypt took place. And Joseph's now lost. What now? What am I going to do? Where's the brothers? They aren't here. They didn't know it was coming. They didn't leave a note. It's not like they could text each other and say, hey, man, where'd you go? I mean, this is just not going to happen. They're not where they're supposed to be. Now what? So he wanders around the fields. Notice something key in verse 15. It does not say he saw a man and asked him a question. It says a man found him. Found him wandering aimlessly in the fields. A man who just happened to know the brothers and just happened to have overheard the brothers saying they were going to Dothan. Great. It's worked out great for Joseph. And when we get to verse 18, we see a level of darkness that rivals pretty much any story on evil you're going to read in Scripture. Joseph heads towards Dothan, which is about 12 miles away from Shechem. The brothers they see him far off, and they recognize him. How did they know it was him? Well, he was wearing a multicolored billboard, of this coat of many colors, a billboard reminding them that he was the favorite of Jacob. Can you imagine? All right, the coat's already an issue, and he's far enough away where they recognize him and have time to plot to kill him. How bright was this coat, right? But they knew him. He's coming. This is the reminder of the announcement of these dreams. They will bow down to the little brother in the coat. The coat's also a reminder that Jacob has chosen Joseph to be head of the family, not one of them, not the older brother, not Reuben for sure. And they immediately, as a group, begin to plot to kill Joseph. Come, let us kill. That is vendetta language. That is murder language. There's no justice in that language. They had it all worked out. We'll kill him. We'll say a wild animal killed him. And we know from other Old Testament shepherds' stories, particularly David. David slew a lion, if you remember that, with a sling, and a bear and all that. So this was the wild animals were an issue. So it seemed like a pretty good plan. But then when we get to verse 19, we really see heart and motivation from these brothers. In verse 19, they see Joseph, and this is what they say. Oh, there comes the dreamer. Let's kill him. Then we'll see what happens to his dreams. This statement is akin to them saying, okay, great Lord of dreams, you think just because you had a dream that you'll lord over us? We can stop that. We'll just kill you, then see what happens to your dreams when you're dead. But if you remember back from the earlier part of 37, what scared the brothers was they realized these dreams were from God. So whose dreams are they actually trying to kill? Whose plans are they actually trying to stop? Reuben has a moment of sanity. You got to remember, Reuben's the older brother. He's the firstborn of Leah, Jacob's first wife. He sort of has a moment of sanity. Don't kill him, throw him in a pit, and just let nature take its course. Now, we know Reuben's intent. Text tells us his intent was to sneak back and pull Jacob out and rescue him. Interestingly enough, Reuben should have had, as the older brother, he should have had the authority to literally, I'm not exaggerating to say this, say to these brothers, we're not doing this. You're not doing this. And they should have listened. But Reuben has lost his authority. He ends up having to trick the brothers. He's probably lost his authority because of his relationship, because of the tryst he had with Bilhah back a few chapters earlier, his father's servant, and the mother of two of the brothers that are plotting to kill Jacob. You got to remember this family dynamic that's going on here. Jacob himself has already, if we go back 2 chapters, you'll remember Jacob himself, it says he knew Reuben did this, And it was an issue. So Jacob's already pushed Reuben aside. So Reuben, as the older brother, has no authority. And honestly, leaving Jacob in a pit to die seems more cruel than just killing him outright. I don't know really what these brothers were thinking here. Maybe they thought if he starved to death in the pit, they'd say, "Oh, we didn't kill him. He died in the pit." I don't know what they were thinking. But they strip him of his Lord of Dreams coat and throw him in a pit. And then notice in verse 24, this particular pit just happened to be close, and this particular pit just happened to be empty. There was no water in it. Now, these pits were not natural pits. These weren't just holes in the ground. These were pits that were dug by people in these areas for different reasons. Sometimes they tossed bodies and trash in them, like dead animal bodies. Sometimes they were storage for grain. Sometimes they were like robber pits where they would, rob you and throw you in a pit. But they were large. They were probably 10 or 12 feet across and anywhere from 16 to 30 feet deep, depending on the purpose of the pit. Now, I don't know how they dug these pits back then. That seems mighty deep. I guess, small shovels and a lot of buckets. But this particular pit was a cistern intended to store water, so it would have been one of the deeper pits. Deep enough to where if it had water in it, Joseph would have probably drowned. But this particular pit just happened to be close, and it just happened to be empty. There's an old saying, man makes plans and God laughs. And I think that's what was happening in this moment, Genesis 37. We're seeing that play out in these brothers' plans. And to let you know a little more about the evil nature of these brothers, the next thing they did after tossing their brother into a pit to die was they sit down and eat lunch. Apparently killing family really works up an appetite. The bizarre, the callous, cold-hearted nature of this just comes off the page, and it shows there was no remorse for their actions. But if you want to add a little bit to this moment, you don't have to turn there, but we learned something in chapter 42, verse 2, where you even get a broader understanding of how evil this event is. Because chapter 42 lets us know a little bit of backstory on this, that Joseph begged his brothers not to kill him, begged his brothers not to throw him in a pit to die, and the brothers didn't listen. Instead, they ate lunch together while Joseph is waiting in a pit to die, not too far away. But, thankfully, there just happened to be a caravan that just happened to be going to Egypt, and it just happened to be Ishmaelites. Now, if the Ishmaelite Midianite thing in the text messes with you a little bit, that's the same people. It would be like me saying, Ishmael is my ancestors, and Median is my home, right? Like I have, according to 23andMe, I have Scottish, Irish, and Welsh blood, but I'm an American, right? Be kind of like that. Or you could even say I'm an American and I'm a Californian. These types of things. We learn in verse 25, though, salvation comes to Joseph. Now, not in the way that I think Joseph would have chosen for salvation to come, but while they were eating, they just happened to see a caravan of traders coming, and these traders just happened to be Ishmaelites, and there's some symbolic things tied to that I'm not really going to go into, but they just also happened to be carrying the same spices that later these brothers would try to use to bargain with Joseph for food in Egypt. And these people just happened to be going to Egypt, the very place Joseph needed to go in order to fulfill the plan of God to save the world. Man, what a coincidence. Judah sees the caravan, he's got an idea. Let's sell him to slave traders. Maybe it was a guilty conscience. I don't know. Maybe guilty conscience goes better with the side of money. I don't know. No, this wasn't a guilty conscience moment Judah was having. This was just simply greed. Guilty conscience would let Judah off the hook, and none of these brothers, not even Reuben, needs to be let off the hook here. Brothers, instead of killing Joseph, let's just sell him, pocket the money. We can still tell Dad he was killed by a wild beast. So the brothers go, they pull Joseph out of the pit. And last night, I was rereading through this last night and thinking, what must Joseph have been thinking as he's in this pit, thinking he's going to die, and now he's being pulled out? I imagine he thought probably for a moment, they've had a change of heart, and they've come back to get me. But instead, they pull him out and they sell him as a slave to the Ishmaelites. So Joseph is sold to traders for 20 shekels of silver, which was the price of a slave under 25 years old, male slave under 25 years old. And we gain a little more insight into Reuben at this point. He's left for some reason. Possibly he was sneaking off. Maybe he claimed to be going on business, or maybe he had business. We don't know why Reuben left. All we know is he comes back to pull Joseph out of the pit, and when he gets there, he finds that Joseph is gone. There's nothing there, and he assumes Joseph is dead, and he goes into mourning. He goes through the mourning ritual, tearing his clothes, and he goes to the brother and says an powerful statement. The boy is dead, and I, where shall I go? Reuben's already on shaky ground with Jacob for sleeping with Bilhah, and now Reuben, the one who should have stood up to the brothers, the one who Jacob will hold responsible if anything were to happen to Joseph, he loses more face with Jacob. He can't even face him. He go home. He said, I can't go home. I have nowhere to go. And I want to read again the last part of this chapter, starting in verse 31. So then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's or not. And he identified it and said, It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces. And then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him. But meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. I wanted to reread that because I wanted us to feel Jacob's grief one more time. Ironically, the way the brothers deceived Jacob was by killing a goat and using the blood on his coat to make him think he was killed by a wild animal. If you remember back to the story of Jacob deceiving Isaac, he killed a goat and took the meat and the fur, the hair from the goat, and used that to deceive his own father. I don't think that's simply coincidence that he was deceived in a similar way that he deceived. The brothers didn't even deliver the information to Jacob themselves. They sent the robe to Jacob. And Jacob's now grieving over the loss of his favorite son, who he thinks has been brutally killed by an animal. He's lost his firstborn son in his mind. This is his firstborn because this is the firstborn of Rachel, the wife that he loved. He's lost the firstborn son of the love of his life, the son that in his mind would lead the family when he was gone. And he's grieving, and he's rightfully so. The son is gone. He should be grieving because grief is a part of humanity. We need to grieve as people. I see a lot of times, a little side note, I see a lot of times of people trying to avoid grief and death, and you don't need to avoid it. You need to embrace it. Grief is part of who we are as humans. Grief comes from loss because we live in a cursed world that comes with that curse, death and destruction. He should have been grieving because there was something Jacob could not see. Not because he wasn't looking, but because God had not revealed it to him. And it's found in the last verse, verse 36. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of the Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. Do you realize how vital to this story that last verse is? That last verse sets the stage for the entire story of the narrative of Joseph, who will at the end of this story say, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. Meanwhile, Joseph is exactly where God wanted him to be. Joseph, through a series of insane coincidences, ends up right where he's supposed to be, right? No, not coincidences. The Word of God teaches us that things we might think are coincidence are actually controlled by a sovereign God. The entire book of Esther is an example of God's providence working through seeming coincidences. That's why God's not mentioned in the book of Esther. Proverbs tells us that the lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord. God's in control even of the things that are as simple as a roll of the dice. The Second London Baptist Confessions talks about providence, and this is what it says about this issue of coincidences. God, the good creator of all things in his infinite power and wisdom, upholds, directs, arranges, and governs all creatures and things from the greatest to the least by his perfectly wise and holy providence. To the purpose for which they were created, he governs according to his infallible foreknowledge and the free and unchangeable counsel of his own will. His providence leads to the praise of the glory of his wisdom, power, justice, infinite goodness, and mercy. So when we see coincidences, we see providence. One famous physicist summed it up this way: coincidence is just God working anonymously. We know and confess that all life is under God's providential control, and we tend to forget that in this monotonous routine of our lives, so-called coincidences should be a splash of cold water on the face. They should be a wake-up moment for us who tend to forget that our world is not simply a matter in motion, that it is God always trying to tell us something, even when we don't listen very well. Where is God in the midst of all this evil? He's right here in the middle of it. He's in the it just so happened. Where'd that man come from in verse 15? The one that found Joseph wandering, 17-year-old Joseph wandering in a field aimlessly. Was that like the angel that Jacob wrestled with? I don't know. Was it just a man God used? I don't know. God just happened to be there. Just happened to know where the brothers were. He just happened to have overheard them say where they were going. In this text, there is evil all around. And if you're not paying attention, it looks like God's nowhere to be seen. But once you see him in this text, you can't unsee it. Too many times I think we don't see God working simply because we're just not looking. Church, our only remedy to remain sane in our current culture is to become a people who stop looking at the temporary and start looking at the eternal, to become a spiritually minded people that see God working even when we're in the pit. God's at work. He's working all around us in the midst of all the evil around us. The world has always been crazy. The only new thing is that crazy is now on display. We gave the crazy uncle social media, and now all the crazy uncles are hanging out with each other. And they'll drag you into their crazy. You know how I know? Because I started watching a steak video and ended up watching Russian dash cam videos. Delusion is now celebrated. Conspiracy theories used to be relegated to the crazy uncle, but now it's gotten so bad, we spend most of our time in the news trying to figure out what's truth and not truth from sources that are supposed to be the arbiters of truth. And then we come to find out sometimes the crazy uncle's right. And that doesn't help. These brothers, though, thought that they could kill Joseph and kill the dream. God is working. There are people out there who probably have good motives but are still destroying the lives of our kids, particularly young girls right now. God's still working. I saw a pretty prominent senator this week get up and announce that we need to shut down and defund all crisis pregnancy centers in America. I'm like, what is wrong with y'all? God's working. Where's God in the midst of evil? He's right where he's always been. He hasn't gone anywhere. And we've got to become a people who look with wide eyes to see God working in the midst of evil all around us. And we've got to be a people who begin to just, this has to become a thing. Like a thing. There's a word I want to use and I can't think of it. I'll probably think of it on my way home. We need to start asking ourselves this question regularly. Where do I see God working in my life right now? If you're a follower of Christ, he's working, I promise. Ephesians 1:11 tells us, in him we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the counsel of his will. We've been predestined according to the purpose of him. Now, I know there's this purpose-driven, everybody's got a purpose in life, right? The purpose is according to the counsel of him who works things according to his will. So your purpose in life is the glory of God. Your purpose in life is his will. Guess what? If you're not a follower of Christ, God's still working. He cannot be stopped. You can't kill God's plan. Even in those moments like Jacob where all we can see is grief, God is still working. It would be 17 years before Jacob got to see the meanwhile in verse 36 of Genesis 37. 17 years. And if we're going to stand firm as Christians when culture assaults us and all around us things seem evil, we're going to have to learn to be a people who say, God put me in a pit to save me from a sword. And see his plan fulfilled to his glory. If I were a different person, less of a procrastinator, I would have planned ahead and been ready to do what I did last night. But honestly, like I say, I had a completely different sermon prepared up until yesterday morning. I sat down and went through this yesterday. I was struggling with verses 15 and 17. Why is this random dude here? It's not a stranger. Who is this guy? And then I thought, you know what? There's no accidents in this text. These 3 verses are in here for a reason. Why are they in here? And I had in my mind all these commentators, God's not here, God's not in the passage, God's not in the passage. And he's not mentioned in the text. They're right. I'm not dominant. They're way smarter than I am. I'm just saying he's not mentioned in the text. But I begin to see God right there in those few verses. And once I saw it there, I couldn't get away from it. I couldn't get away from it. Flipping back, because I just thought of a better conclusion for the sermon I wrote yesterday. There just happened to be a man who just happened to know where the brothers were. There just happened to be a pit that just happened to be empty. There just happened to be a caravan that just happened to be going to Egypt. That just happened to be Ishmaelites. That somehow just happened to get Joseph right where he needed to be. Could God have gotten Joseph to Potiphar a different way? Well, of course he could have. He just didn't. Why? I don't know, and this is the part we need to understand as believers. It doesn't matter. God didn't tell us that for a reason. My dad, I've heard him say it 1,000 times. Anytime we see God doing one thing, there's 1,000 things he's doing we don't see. And that's where faith comes in. That's where trust comes in. So what I did last night was I ordered some custom refrigerator magnets that simply say, where do I see God working in my life right now? Now, they say they'll be here by next Sunday. But I don't know how y'all shipping stuff's going. So I make no promises. They'll be here when they get here. And I want you to take one and I want you to put it somewhere where you'll see it every day. And ponder that question, ask that question, so we can become a people who always see God working even in the middle of the evil that is around us.